Fear, when properly engineered and systematically deployed, requires remarkably little actual violence to achieve comprehensive control over entire populations, because the human mind, once convinced that surveillance is omnipresent and punishment is inevitable, will construct its own prison bars and station its own guards and perform its own interrogations without any external coercion becoming necessary. The most sophisticated totalitarian systems understand this principle intuitively and build their apparatus of control not primarily through the application of terror, but through the cultivation of its anticipation, through the creation of psychological environments where people police themselves more effectively than any secret police force could ever police them, where the fear of what might happen becomes more powerful than the reality of what actually does happen, where the mere possibility of denunciation and arrest and disappearance suffices to produce the conformity and silence and obedience that direct violence could only achieve through constant and exhausting application. Nazi Germany perfected this alchemy of fear, transforming the relatively modest resources of the Gestapo and the security apparatus into a perceived omnipresence that shaped the behavior of millions, despite the mathematical impossibility of actually surveilling and monitoring such a vast population with the limited personnel and technology available. At its peak, the Gestapo employed approximately 32,000 officers to monitor a population of 66 million Germans, a ratio that made comprehensive surveillance objectively impossible. That meant most Germans would never encounter a Gestapo officer in their entire lives. That left vast gaps in coverage that any coordinated resistance movement should have been able to exploit. Yet, the regime functioned as if the Gestapo were everywhere simultaneously, as if every conversation might be overheard and every deviation from orthodoxy would be detected and punished. And this illusion of omnipresence was maintained through psychological mechanisms far more sophisticated than any surveillance technology of the era could have provided. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today, we examine how fear was transformed from an emotion into an architecture, exploring the specific techniques through which the Nazi regime convinced an entire population that resistance was impossible and that conformity was the only rational response to circumstances, analyzing the psychological mechanisms through which people came to surveil themselves and police their own thoughts and betray their neighbors, and recognizing that these mechanisms remain available and potent in any society that chooses to deploy them. Because the vulnerabilities they exploit are permanent features of human social psychology, rather than artifacts of particular historical circumstances or cultural contexts. But first, if you like this exploration of the human mind, please leave a like and subscribe to Forgotten Minds. It helps me continue this work. There's much darker truth still ahead. Thank you. The Gestapo's power derived less from its actual capabilities than from a carefully cultivated mythology about those capabilities. A mythology that the regime actively encouraged and that the population amplified through rumor and speculation and the psychological tendency to overestimate the surveillance capacities of authorities when operating under conditions of uncertainty and threat. The Gestapo made strategic use of highly visible arrests and public demonstrations of their reach, choosing targets and timing interventions to create maximum psychological impact, while conserving their limited resources for cases that genuinely threatened regime stability. When someone disappeared in the middle of the night, when a family returned home to find their apartment searched and specific items confiscated. When whispered conversations were somehow known to authorities who came asking questions days or weeks later. These events created the impression of an organization that saw and heard everything, that had infiltrated every workplace and neighborhood and social circle, that possessed methods of intelligence gathering that ordinary citizens could not comprehend or predict. The reality was far more mundane and far more disturbing in what it revealed about human behavior under pressure. The Gestapo's intelligence came primarily not from sophisticated surveillance technology or vast networks of trained agents, but from voluntary denunciations by ordinary Germans who reported on neighbors and colleagues and even family members, motivated by a complex mixture of genuine ideological conviction, personal grievances, and petty vendettas that could be prosecuted through political accusations, careerism, and the desire to demonstrate loyalty and vigilance to authorities, and simple fear that failure to report suspicious behavior might itself be construed as complicity or disloyalty if that behavior were discovered through other means. The Gestapo received millions of denunciations throughout the Nazi period, far more than their limited personnel could possibly investigate thoroughly, which meant they could be selective about which cases to pursue, while maintaining the impression that all reports were taken seriously and might lead to consequences. This system of voluntary denunciation created a social environment where trust became impossible and paranoia became rational, where any casual comment or private doubt expressed to the wrong person could trigger an investigation, and where people learned, through bitter experience, that relationships they had considered safe and confidential could become sources of betrayal. The psychological effect was to make people surveil themselves far more comprehensively than any external authority could have managed, to create internal sensors that monitored thoughts and speech constantly, because the boundary between safe private expression and dangerous public statement had collapsed, because you could never be certain who might report you or what innocent remark might be interpreted as treasonous when filtered through the ideological lens of an informant or investigator seeking to demonstrate their vigilance and loyalty. The ambiguity and unpredictability of enforcement amplified these effects rather than diminishing them, because when punishment is arbitrary and the rules that govern safety are unclear and constantly shifting, people respond by adopting maximum caution and self-censorship as the only reliable strategy for avoiding danger. If speaking critically about the regime always led to arrest, people could calibrate their behavior accordingly and simply avoid such speech. But when some people were arrested for comments that others made with apparent impunity, when the factors determining who would be targeted and who would be ignored remained mysterious and seemed to have no consistent pattern, the rational response was to assume that any deviation might trigger consequences and to police oneself accordingly, to maintain performance of loyalty and enthusiasm, even in contexts that seemed private and safe, because the boundary between surveillance and privacy had been rendered unknowable. The transformation of fear into self-sustaining control required not just the threat of punishment, but the creation of social environments where conformity was continuously reinforced through peer pressure, and where deviation was immediately visible and socially costly, even before any official intervention occurred. The Nazi regime understood that human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose behavior is shaped more by the perceived expectations and judgments of those around them than by abstract principles or private beliefs, and they structured public life to ensure that Nazi loyalty was constantly performed and evaluated in social contexts where the costs of nonconformity were immediate and obvious, while the benefits of enthusiastic participation were tangible and rewarding. The workplace became a theatre where loyalty was performed through participation in party organizations and through visible enthusiasm for regime policies and through careful attention to the ideological orthodoxy of comments made during breaks and informal conversations. Those who failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm, who remained silent when others expressed support for Nazi policies, who showed insufficient interest in party activities and regime celebrations, marked themselves as suspect and found themselves excluded from promotions and desirable assignments, found themselves the subjects of increased scrutiny and speculation about their reliability, found that colleagues began to distance themselves because association with someone of questionable loyalty might itself be dangerous to career prospects and social standing. The effect was to create environments where people competed to demonstrate their commitment and vigilance, where each person's performance of loyalty served to raise the baseline expectations for everyone else, where silence or neutrality became increasingly impossible as the ambient level of expressed enthusiasm ratcheted upward through competitive social dynamics. The neighborhood became similarly structured around surveillance and judgment, with block wardens who monitored residents and who noted who displayed flags with appropriate enthusiasm, and who attended party rallies and whose children were active in Hitler Youth, and whose families maintained proper ideological discipline in visible aspects of their daily lives. The block warden system created local authority figures who derived their status and power from their role in monitoring compliance, who had incentives to discover and report deviations to demonstrate their own vigilance and value to the regime, who could employ their positions to settle personal scores or to extract favours from residents who feared being reported for real or invented transgressions. The knowledge that someone in your immediate environment had both the authority to report you and the motivation to do so created a constant low-level anxiety that shaped behaviour in ways that were cumulative and comprehensive, that made people conscious at all times of how their actions might be perceived and reported, that transformed private space into performed public space, where deviation from orthodoxy was never truly safe. The rituals and symbols that saturated public space created additional layers of surveillance and enforcement that operated through social pressure rather than through official coercion. When the flag was raised, or when Nazi anthems were played, or when ritual salutes were required, these moments became tests of loyalty that were administered constantly and that were witnessed by everyone present, creating situations where your response was immediately visible to those around you, and where any hesitation or insufficiency in your performance marked you as potentially disloyal and triggered social consequences. Even if no official intervention followed, the person who saluted with less enthusiasm than those around them, who sang less loudly or whose arm was raised less promptly or held less rigidly at the correct angle, became instantly noticeable and became the subject of comment and speculation and eventual informal or formal consequences that taught everyone observing that conformity down to the smallest gesture was not optional but mandatory. The ultimate achievement of Nazi fear architecture was the extent to which external surveillance and social pressure became internalized as self-surveillance. As people learned to monitor their own thoughts and speech and behavior with a vigilance that exceeded what any external authority could have maintained, as the sensor that mattered most became the one inside your own head that operated continuously and automatically to suppress any impulse or idea or expression that might be dangerous if somehow discovered or reported. This internalization represented the perfection of control because it required no ongoing expenditure of resources by the regime. No Gestapo officers or informants or block wardens actively monitoring and intervening. Only the psychological mechanisms that had been established during the period of visible enforcement and that now operated autonomously as permanent features of how people thought and perceived and responded to their environment. The process of internalization occurred through mechanisms that psychological research has since identified and studied extensively. The repeated pairing of thought or speech with fear of consequences created automatic associations that triggered anxiety whenever certain ideas or expressions began to form, training the mind to suppress them reflexively before they could fully develop into conscious awareness. The observation of others being punished for deviations created vicarious learning that taught what was dangerous, without requiring direct personal experience of punishment. The continuous performance of loyalty in social contexts gradually eroded the distinction between authentic belief and strategic performance, as cognitive dissonance created pressure to align internal attitudes with external behavior. As the psychological cost of maintaining permanent hypocrisy became too great, and as people resolved the tension by convincing themselves that they actually believed what they found themselves expressing and performing day after day in public contexts. The social isolation that fear produced reinforced these internalizing processes by eliminating the interpersonal contexts where alternative perspectives might have been preserved and transmitted, where people might have discovered that others shared their doubts and their private resistance to regime ideology, where collective consciousness of shared opposition might have formed and provided psychological resources for maintaining internal distance from the roles they were forced to perform externally. When every relationship becomes potentially treacherous, when trust becomes impossible, and when expressing doubt to anyone means risking denunciation, people retreat into complete isolation, where their private thoughts have no social validation or reinforcement, where the only voices they hear are those that reinforce regime ideology through propaganda and through the performed enthusiasm of public spaces, where their own doubts and resistances begin to seem increasingly implausible and perhaps pathological because they have no confirmation that anyone else shares them or that they represent anything other than personal deficiency or dangerous deviance. The identity transformations that resulted from years of living in this psychological environment were profound and often permanent, as people who had initially performed loyalty strategically while maintaining private resistance gradually found that the performance had consumed the authentic self, that they could no longer clearly distinguish between what they genuinely believed and what they had learned to say and think automatically to protect themselves. The mechanisms of moral disengagement that had originally been employed consciously as strategies for psychological survival became unconscious and automatic features of cognition, ways of perceiving reality, and evaluating ethical questions that no longer required conscious activation, but operated as the default mode through which experience was processed and interpreted. The Nazi system of control through fear reveals with mathematical precision how little actual violence is required to achieve comprehensive domination once the psychological architecture has been properly constructed and the population has learned the rules of survival. Under conditions of manufactured omnipresence and arbitrary punishment, the Gestapo's 32,000 officers could not have physically monitored or directly coerced 66 million Germans into continuous compliance through their own efforts. Yet the system functioned as if surveillance were total and punishment were inevitable because the population had been trained to surveil itself and to police its own members and to internalize the censor that made external enforcement largely unnecessary, except in cases where examples needed to be made to reinforce the mythology of omnipresence and to remind people of what could happen if the internal controls failed and behavior deviated too far from acceptable norms. The efficiency of this system, measured in terms of the ratio between resources invested in control mechanisms and the extent of compliance achieved, exceeded what any system based primarily on direct coercion could have accomplished, because direct violence and surveillance require constant expenditure of resources and create incentives for resistance and evasion, while fear-based self-surveillance operates continuously without requiring external input, once the psychological patterns have been established through initial demonstrations and through the social architecture that makes conformity visible and deviation costly, even before official intervention occurs. The elegance of the mechanism lies in its self-sustaining quality, in the way it transforms subjects into their own jailers and converts social relationships into surveillance networks, and makes resistance seem not just dangerous but impossible because the architecture of control appears to be omnipresent, even though the actual resources dedicated to enforcement are modest and the gaps in coverage are vast. The historical lesson extends far beyond Nazi Germany and remains relevant to understanding how authoritarian control functions in any context, because the psychological mechanisms that made Nazi fear architecture effective are permanent features of human social cognition rather than artifacts of particular cultural or historical circumstances. Human beings will always be vulnerable to systems that convince them they are being watched even when they are not, that make voluntary denunciation seem rational or necessary, through mixtures of ideology and personal incentive and fear of being seen as complicit through silence, that structure social environments to make conformity immediately rewarding and visible, while making deviation costly and obvious, that exploit the social nature of human cognition to turn communities into mutual surveillance networks, where everyone monitors everyone else, and where trust becomes impossible. The warning is that totalitarian control, when properly engineered, requires remarkably little violence, because the most effective prison is the one that subjects construct for themselves through psychological mechanisms of self-surveillance and internalized censorship, that the most comprehensive surveillance network is the one that emerges from voluntary denunciation and social pressure rather than from technology or professional intelligence services, that the most successful dictatorships are those that convince populations that resistance is impossible, and that compliance is the only rational response to circumstances, creating the self-fulfilling prophecy where the belief in totalitarian omnipresence makes that omnipresence functionally real despite its actual limitations. This has been forgotten minds. The Gestapo files were eventually captured, and their actual scope revealed to be far more limited than the mythology had suggested. The network of informants proved to be far less comprehensive than the paranoia had assumed. The surveillance capabilities turned out to be far more modest than the population had believed during the years when that belief shaped behavior and crushed resistance. Yet by the time these truths became known, the control had already been achieved and maintained for 12 years through mechanisms that required very little actual violence because the population had been trained to police itself and to believe that escape was impossible, demonstrating the terrible efficiency of systems that transform fear from an emotion into an architecture that ordinary people maintain through their own behavior, even as they experience themselves as its victims, rather than as its builders. Until next time, stay vigilant.